This isn't a regular tutorial. This is a crash course that's going to take you into how to build a real-time chat application using JavaScript SDKs and CometChat. And as part of this, it's going to be a 2-hour massive course where we're going to go into depth into everything from sending and receiving messages to doing search and history, delivery reports, and much, much more. If you're wondering what we're actually building, it's the JavaScript SDK version of CometChat, which will include using VS Code as well as our debugger to build this all out. The goal of this is to give you an inside view if you're trying to build your own application so you understand the fundamentals of how everything in terms of messaging works. Now, without further ado, let's just get started.
The first thing we're going to do is head over to the CometChat website. Here, we want to head over to the developer section and to documentation. This will open up a new page, and on here, we want to head to SDKs. We're going to select the JavaScript one, which is the very first one over here, and we're going to head over to the setup section, which will cover how we're going to get it up and running. The next thing you'll want to do is head back to the website and sign up for a brand new account. I already have one, so I'm simply going to sign in. This will take you to the dashboard, and here you'll be able to create a brand new application. To do this, simply select the plus sign over here, give your application a name as well as a region, and we'll select a version 3 here. After that, add the application and you have a couple of bits of information here. These will include things like the app ID as well as the authentication key, but we can take a look at those a little bit later on. Let's head back into the documentation over here. We're going to take our very first step now into installing CometChat and its dependencies. And we're going to do this by calling the npm install command and pulling in the library just over here. So let's open up VS Code to run this command in our project. Here I have VS Code open up. And what I'm going to do is open up the console here and paste in this command to install the latest version of CometChat. Right now we're running version 3.0.6, but your version might be a newer version, so have a look at what that currently is. This installs nice and quick and we're ready to go. I'm going to create a new file called index.js and we'll be using this for the project. What we'll do next is have a look at how to import it into a JavaScript file. It's actually quite simple. You just import CometChat from the CometChat library, just like this. Here we get an example of what the syntax will look like once we start using it. Now, in some cases, you might not be using Node, for example, with CometChat. You might be using it inside of a project of a HTML file. The other way to import CometChat is just with regular HTML. Let's head back into our project here and create an alternative index.html file. And what I'm going to do is paste in a basic HTML start guide, which is just running a bit of Bootstrap. I'm going to copy over this syntax here for the HTML content, and I'm going to place this here in the footer part of the additional JavaScript. And what we're doing here is importing CometChat from the CDN library unpack, and we're going to be able to use it after we've imported it. What we're going to do now is jump into the JS file and complete most of the rest of the content just here. But once we're done, we can head back to the HTML file and paste most of this content in and it'll work the same. Let's jump into the index.js file. Here, I'm going to pass in a few variables that I want to assign. The very first one is let app ID equal your ID. We'll fill this out a little bit later on. Next, add in app region. And here we want that to be your region. And we want let app settings equal new CometChat.appSettingsBuilder. This will create a new class object for us to use later when initializing. We're going to actually pass in a few additions to this. Previously, we would have had subscriber presence 4, but with version 3, we're going to call subscribe presence for all users. And here we've got the autocomplete completing that. We're also going to pass in set region to the region variable we set earlier. And finally, we're going to pass in auto establish the socket connection to true. Now we can run the build function to essentially pull all of this together before we initialize the application settings. We're going to call CometChat init, and here we're going to pass in the app ID as well as the app settings. Then we're going to call a function with no variables, and this is going to pass in a couple of things to let us know that it's running. The very first thing will just be an initialization success message from console log, and the other one will be an error in case it didn't work. And here we're just going to simply pass in initialization failed with the following error. This completes initializing CometChat with the application settings that we're currently setting. But we're missing one thing, which is the application ID and the region itself. So what we'll need to do is head back into the CometChat settings. We'll copy over the region here, which is currently set to US. And I'm going to paste this here into the region app variable. The other is the actual app ID itself. And this is this value over here. So I'm also going to copy paste this value here into the app ID. That's basically it. We can now test out all of this code. Now this all is front-end code that basically sits on the client side. This means that normally you can use this code inside of a React application or a Vue or Angular application, but you can't use this using Node.js or on a backend. So just be aware of that. We are going to be putting this into our index.html file. So we're going to do this in two ways. The very first way is just to comment out this top line here, since we're already importing the script for CometChat, and just copy over this JavaScript syntax. Here in our JavaScript, I'm just going to pull up a new script tag here, which we'll pass in, and then we can simply paste in the settings that we've created. I'm going to hit save on that, and we're going to test these out by selecting to run a live server, which I've just got running as a plugin in the background. We've got this hello world that we've created, and if I open up the actual console here, we'll see that the script has loaded. It's got the text initialization successful, the same as in our JavaScript file. Another way we could run this script is by removing the manual code and actually importing the file that we're using. So in this case, we would simply be importing the index.js file. Let's hit save on that and jump back into our project over here. And I'm going to do a refresh, and you can see that initialization successful has still loaded up, which is great. If we remove this file and do a refresh, we see that there are no comments. So this means that the file is in fact working correctly. Now that we've got this up and running, let's take a quick look at the code to understand what's going on. We understand that we're setting an app ID and a region, which we're using further down in the file. This is just our own settings here. The next thing we're doing is setting a variable here for the app setting as a new class that we're setting over here. The actual subscription presence for all users is where we're basically representing the subscription type for the user presence, whether it's real-time online or offline or whatnot. The auto-establish socket connection is basically a Boolean value which we're passing as true or false. If it's true, it informs the SDK that the WebSocket connection is internally set. If it's false though, the SDK for that WebSocket connection is managed manually. This defaults to true normally if you don't add in a parameter, but I've put in true just so that you recognize that's what's happening. That's basically it. Then we're initializing the application. This is we're passing in that app ID as well as the settings we've just created. And here we can start to add in additional items that can run after the initialization of CometChat. This time we're moving on to authentication. For the authentication section, we're going to do a couple of tasks. The first will be to create a user. After we've completed that, we're going to do a login with an auth key, and then we're also going to do a login with a token. We'll finally finish up on creating a logout. Authentication inside of CometChat is essentially allowing users to connect to it and identifying who they are. There are a number of sample users that you can normally use if you're building a new app, such as Superhero 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. but the recommended practice is to create your own users. You can do this by logging into the dashboard or even using the API. In this example, we're going to open up the CometChat dashboard in order to do this. Let's open it up here. I've already logged in, but if you haven't, you'll need to log in and create your first new app. In here, you can select the application and you're going to get a dashboard with a menu on the left-hand side here with a lot of other options. What we're going to do is select the user option just here on the left-hand side. Here you can see those superhero 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 accounts. But on top of that, we're going to select to add a brand new account. So let's select add user. Here I'm just going to put myself. So I'll select the name as Adrian. The UID is the unique identifier. This can be a number of things, but for the time being, I'm going to select Adrian. In the future, you might want to have this as a hash. The avatar and the link as well as the metadata, I'll keep empty for the time being. Let's select to add the user. Now it's here in our list and we can start using it. So you'll remember in the past setup video, we created an initializer for CometChat. This essentially means that CometChat is up and running. In this video, however, we're going to be looking at authentication. Specifically, we're going to log in a user using the login method. The login method is something that you just want to use once. You don't want to log people in every single time because once they're logged in, they're already authenticated. If you do want to check what kind of user is logged in, you can simply call the CometChat get logged in user method, and this will check if there are any existing sessions inside of this SDK instance. This will allow you to get the details of the login user as well. Otherwise, if they're not logged in, it'll just return a null, which indicates that there is no session present currently and the user will need to be logged in. Here you can find the previous code we created for the setup of CometChat. Down here, we've initialized the application, so it's ready for us to apply some session information, such as the login. The very first thing that you want to do is check whether or not a user is already logged in. So let's start with that. We'll call a command here called CometChat get user logged in. Then we'll create a function to see if that user returns with an object. And if there is no user object, then we can, for example, perform a login request. We'll take a look at all of this in a moment, but let's actually have a look at the types of variables that we'll need in order to perform this action. The very first is a UID. This can be stored inside of your database. In my case, I created one previously and it was just called Adrian to keep things nice and simple. We can actually use some of the example super users we had previously, but for the time being, that should be fine. The next thing we'll need is an auth key. For this, you'll be able to get this inside of your dashboard. So let's actually head over to the CometChat dashboard here for a quick start, and we'll head over to the auth key. We're going to select to copy this, and I'm going to paste this here below. We'll be able to use these two values to do a login request. So let's jump back into our section here for CometChat to get the logged in user. If, for example, there is null for the user, it returns empty. We can do this if script here, and we can pass in this command called CometChat.login UID auth key then. I'm going to fill this out and explain what's happening exactly here. Right now, we're performing a login request. We're passing in the UID or the user ID, and we're passing in the authentication key for this application. If we get a return for the user, we're completing the login successfully. But if we get a null again for the user, we've failed the login. Maybe there's an issue with the auth key or the UID. I always like to add additional notes here about what's actually happening. So in this case, I'm going to pass in user is not logged in. In this section here, I'm going to pass in that the user has logged in successfully. And over here, I'm going to pass in that the user has failed the login. This completes more or less a session where there is no user logged in just yet. But in some instances, a user might have already logged in. In those cases, we want to pass an else script in because we only want to perform this if the user has already logged in. Here, I'm going to keep it nice and simple. I'm just going to pass in that the user has already logged in, and then I'm going to console out the user. Let's test all of this out. Now that we have all of this code complete, we can head to our index.html that we created previously. Here, we're pulling in the CometChat library for the JavaScript SDK, and then we're calling our index.js file. This will call this file here, which should initialize and perform a login. We are going to test this out by running up a live server, which is just a plugin inside of VS Code. Let's do this now. Here I've got my hello world. What I'm going to do is open up the console and see what's happening. What we're getting is a initialization successful. Here we have a login success, which has popped up, which means that CometChat has actually worked. Then we also have this outline of a user object that we've passed through because we've completed a successful login. Let's do one more page refresh. This time we're not already performing a login because we're already logged in. So instead the console message here is already logged in, and then we have the outline of the user object here. Now this is just a simple authentication procedure. This is something you would use inside of development, and currently there is no additional security applied to that, and you would have to apply that yourself. Also be aware that we are using the auth key, but just make sure you never use the REST API key, because this could be maliciously used if users get access to it. For this next part, we'll be taking a look at creating a login using an authentication token, which is a much more secure way to do so. We can do this usually by generating one through the API. The three steps that you would normally perform are: 1, you would create the user through the API on the backend. Next, you would create an authentication token for that user on the backend. And then you would use that authentication token to perform the login on the front end. We'll take a look at how to do this through the dashboard in this case, since we don't have a backend server up and running just yet. In order to get an authentication token, we're going to head over to the users section. We're going to select the user, which in this case is the one that I created called Adrian, and we're going to select 2 authentication tokens. Here we can generate a new authentication token, which we've just created over here. If you want to know how to do this on the backend, you would head over to the actual API's configuration and head over to auth tokens. Here you have an example of how to perform an API request to generate the same sort of thing. There is another option, which is the actual API generated content creator that you can utilize and test out yourself. Here you can place in all the things that you would normally do on your backend server, and you can perform an example to see what that would look like. Here I'm going to pass in a regular example for a superhero one, and here it passes back the auth token, which we could use then on the front end server. Moving back to our example here, I'm going to copy this auth key that I created for the Adrian token. We can copy and save this, and we're going to jump back into our file here in JS, and we're going to select this option right over here. We're going to then have a look at updating this code that we previously had and changing it a little bit. In this case, I'm going to leave most of it, but this section here where we created a brand new login, we're going to comment out. Instead, we're going to create a new type of login. So let's pass in CometChat login, and instead of doing a UID and an auth key, what we're going to do instead is we're going to select to use a simple auth token and pass it in as a variable just like this. I'm also going to create this variable just over here called an auth token and pass this in, which we just created. This auth token is now ready to use, and for the most part, the rest of the configuration here is exactly the same. So I'm going to uncomment this code, and we'll be able to test this out in just a second, because there is one final thing that we haven't looked at, which is actually logging the user out. This is what we'll need to do because we're currently in a logged in session, so it's going to remember that. To perform a logout, we simply need to run the method logout and then check to make sure that it is successful. This is a method that you'd only use if the user is logged in. So I'm going to perform it just over here. After we've checked that the user is in fact logged in, I'm going to say let's log them out. In order to log them out, we're going to call CometChat logout. Then we're going to check that the function has completed. Then we're going to console out logout is successful. If, for example, we run into any errors, we're also going to console log out the error that occurred. I think that pretty much sums it up, so I'm happy to uncomment this code and test it out in production. Let's head over to our website over here and open up the console and hit refresh. It seems that we are missing one comma here, so I'm going to pass that in over here, I believe, and that should clean that up. Let's refresh one more time, and we can see that now we're performing a successful login. We'll hit refresh now. Now that we've performed a successful login and we are already logged in, we perform a logout request. If we refresh one more time, we're performing another login. Each one of these logins are now using an auth token instead of an auth key, which is a more secure way. And normally you would pass in this auth token through your backend server. We wouldn't normally log them out and log them in continuously, but this is just an example to see what that process looks like. Here we're going to cover these three main aspects, which is to send a text message, a media message, and a custom message. Let's have a look at each. The text message is the most common type of message that you're often sending, which is just plain text. Media messages are things like photos as well as videos and files, and custom messages are when you want to send more interesting data using things like JSON format. I'm going to continue the project we're creating where we've initialized the CometChat as well as configured it, and we've logged a new user in. After the login, we're going to perform a send message. So let's have a look at how we do that. The first thing I'm going to pass in is the receiver ID, which is the unique ID of the user or the group. Here I'm going to use let receiver ID equal Adrian, which is what we created earlier. The next thing we want to do is the receiver type. This is whether you're sending to a user or a group. So I'm going to pass in let receiver type equal CometChat.receiver_type.user. The other type is of course group. The next variable I'll set is the message text, which will just be a plain text message of hello world which we'll send. So let's pass that in. Finally, we'll want to combine all of this together into an actual text message, which we'll pass as a variable. This will be created when we pass in the new CometChat.text message, assigning the variables that we've now set with the receiver ID, the text message, and the receiver type. We're now ready to perform the send message method. We can call this by calling CometChat.sendMessage and passing in the text message and performing a request. Here we're going to get back a reply with a variable called message, and this message is the one that we can use inside of our application. Since we're just starting out, we're simply going to console out that we've sent the message and then console out the message itself. It's also useful to do some error logging, so I'll pass in error here and I'll also console log that out so that we can see if there are any failures. Now let's test this all out. I'm going to open up a live server with the plugin from VS Code. Here I have an instance of Chrome with my console up and running. We've initialized the application and logged the user in, and we've sent a message. We can actually open up the message to take a look at it. Here we can see that it's a text message with the text itself, going to the user ID of Adrian as a user type, as well as a number of other data attributes that we could use inside of our application to configure it in any which way. The other type of message we can send is a group message. What I'm going to do is pass in the receiver type here as group and create a receiver ID of test group, but this doesn't actually exist yet. In order for it to exist, we need to head into our dashboard. We'll select our app, and for the time being, we'll perform this action inside of the admin tools. We'll head over to groups, and here we'll create a brand new group. This group will be called our test group. I'm just going to give that the name and set it to a public group type. And here's our test group. We can jump in here and have a look at the details, or we can head over to the members and have a look at who is currently in the group. But for the time being, now that we have these set, let's jump back into our application and test this out. We'll open up our example app here and we're going to refresh the page and see what happens. Here we have a message that says the user, currently Adrian, is not part of the member of the group, and this means we have to add Adrian into the group in order for him to send or receive messages from that group. Let's head back to the admin dashboard and head over to users. Then we'll select Adrian over here. We'll head over to groups and we're going to add him to the test group. We'll select add over here and that should add the permissions, and now we should be able to simply head back into our example here and refresh the page, and now we can see that the test message has been sent successfully to the group. Now a plain text message saying hello world sometimes isn't enough. Sometimes we need to pass in metadata. Let's have a look at how to do this. We're going to set some metadata here by creating a new object called metadata with a latitude as well as a longitude. We're going to add this into the text message so that it's delivered as part of the send message method. All we have to do is actually call the text method, set the metadata by calling the method setMetadata, and pass in the metadata variable. Nice and simple. We can do the same thing for tags as well. What I'll do is create a new tags variable, and this will actually be an array. Since tags can have one or multiple options, I'm going to pass in tag 1 and tag 2. We're going to add these to the text message by simply adding in textMessage.setTags with the variable tags in there. All of these are now safely passed over to the CometChat sendMessage method. We're now going to take a look at sending a media message. This is a little bit different. We'll be using the sendMediaMessage method, and we're going to pass in a media message object as part of that. Media messages can include a couple of things, such as photos or videos or files. We're going to have to define which type, and there's two main ways to do this. The very first type is to provide the file using the traditional HTML methods, such as an input, and then we classify and upload that file to the CometChat server. The second way to do this is using a URL. In this case, we're passing in the URL as part of that request, and once again, CometChat is using that URL to apply that to the message. Let's start off with uploading a file. We'll head to index.html, and we'll need an input to be able to do this. What I'm going to do is create a simple file input. So I'm going to set the type here to file, and then I'm going to give it a class as well as an ID. For both the class and the ID, I'm going to do a image_file, and we'll later be referencing it when we're creating a function to upload it. We also need a button so that when we are performing the action, we can call it. So here, I'm just going to create a simple button with an onClick handler that will call the function sendMessage. This will just be called send. Now we can open up a script tag and create our sendMessage function. So let's add that in here. Let's call function sendMessage, and inside of here, we'll begin drafting out the message and how it functions. We need a few things for this send message to work inside of CometChat. As per usual, we'll need the UID, which is the user ID that we'll be sending from. So let's create a UID here of Adrian. Next, I need to create a variable called file. Here, we're going to find the file that we're uploading by calling document.getElementID and grabbing the ID of image_file. This comes as an array of files, so I'm going to call index 0, which is the very first one. The next thing that we need is the file type. So let's create a new variable for that called file type, and this is going to be the CometChat message_type.image, since I want to upload an image in this case. There are other types, such as video as a type, as well as audio as well, being a type that can be used. And finally, we have the file as a type, which should cover all other examples. Just like text messages, we need to assign a user type. Here, I'm going to call CometChat.receiver_type.user instead of group, since this time I just want a regular user message. With that done, we can now create our media message. Let's assign a value here called media message and call new space CometChat.mediaMessage and pass in the UID, the file type, as well as the user type. This pretty much initializes all the settings we need to be able to send this media message. Now we can simply send it. In order to send it, we're going to call CometChat.sendMediaMessage, and then we're going to place the media message here as the object we're passing across. We can now call this, and we're going to get back a message here. Let's pass this into a function and console log it out to see what we're getting. First, we'll console log out that the message has been successfully sent. And second of all, we'll console out the message itself and test it out to see how it works. I'll also add in some error handling because that's always useful whenever creating any functionality. Now let me open up the Chrome browser here, and we can see that we've got our file and our send button. I've got the console running in the background here, and I'm going to select to upload a recent image of myself to this example. I'm going to select the send button, and when I do, you can see that the actual message sent successfully, and we also get a preview of the message itself. We can pull out the data of this message, and we can have a look at where the URL is and where it's been uploaded. We can literally test this out by copying the URL into the browser and making sure that it works, which it has. For our next example, we're going to upload a file, a media type file, using a URL rather than uploading it through traditional HTML. We're going to create a brand new function for this. We're going to call it sendURLMessage, and we're going to update our old function here, just calling it send file message. This new message we can place into our onClick handler inside of our button so that we can call it next time. Now it looks a little bit different than our previous example, so we're going to write this up from scratch so you can get a better idea of how it works. We'll start by defining our very first variable. This will be the receiver ID. This is going to just be Adrian once again, since I just want to send this to myself. The next thing that we need is a message type. This can be gained by passing in CometChat.message_type.image, since it's an image we'll be using. As always, we need to define the receiver type, so we'll pass in receiver type equals CometChat.receiver_type.user, since we're just passing it to a user this time. Let's define our media message. This is similar to what we did when we were uploading an image. So we'll just do let media message equals new CometChat.mediaMessage. We're going to define the actual receiver ID. We're going to pass in blank for the actual file, since we're going to define that next. And then finally, we'll pass in the message type as well as the receiver type. Now it's time to define a file. Let's create a new variable called file. It's going to be an object, and it's going to have a few attributes. The very first one is name. Here, I'm just going to give it the name of CometChat. We also define the actual file extension, so I'm going to pass in JPG here. The next type is the meme type. Now, this is going to be usually, if it's an image, something like image/JPG, so it gives context to the file type. Finally, we pass in the URL. You can see that this example is actually using PNG as a file type, so I'll actually update the file parameters for that. The final thing we need to do is attach this file to the media message. We need to create an attachment for that. Let's create a variable called letAttachment equal new CometChat.attachment and pass in the file. This now needs to be added into the media message. So we'll pass in media message.setAttachment and pass in this new attachment we've just created. Great, the media message is now ready to be used. We can literally use the same send media message format that we created earlier on as part of this message. So let's copy paste that in above and give it a test. I'm going to open up Chrome again and refresh the page, and let's see how this works. Beautiful, we've sent our message and we can expand out the data. The data has a number of attachments, and on the very first one we've got our PNG as well as the URL that it's from. Let's view these to make sure it's working, and yes it is. Okay, now it's time to take a look at our final message type, which is a custom message. I'm going to copy over this send URL message function and we're going to customize it. Let's get rid of all the media content, such as even the media message type, and we'll start fresh with a custom message. I'm going to update the function to be called send custom message, and I'm going to use this on my onClick handler in the button. I'm also going to go through all the common aspects of a media message and update those to be a custom message. So here I'll define a let custom message to equal a new CometChat custom message, and we'll also send a custom message with the variable custom message applied to the final function. Now that we have that set, we just need some custom data. I'll create a new variable here called custom data with a latitude as well as a longitude. This is a location, so we also need to define a custom data type. We create that using the custom type with a string attached. This string is nice and simple, and I'm just going to call it location for the time being. This is pretty much everything we need. We just need to update the new CometChat custom message prompt here because the actual arrangement of these are a little bit different. We start off with the receiver ID, then we move on to the receiver type, then we need to pass in the custom type, and then finally the custom data comes last. Okay, let's test this out. I'm going to open up Chrome here, and we're just going to do a quick refresh and click the send button. Here we can see that the data has successfully sent. We're sending a custom type of location, and the data here is located in custom data, and we can extract that and see that latitude and longitude is there, which is absolutely great. We're going to be doing a few things here, but the main ones will be having a look at adding a listener to receive real-time messages in an application while it's running. And the second will be to retrieve missed messages when the application isn't running. So real-time messages are essentially received when an application is running. What happens is that there is a message listener, which we use to capture incoming messages. We do this by using the add message listener method, and this can be found just down here, which we're going to implement very shortly, where we define a listener ID, and then we start capturing messages that are being sent to us. Let's implement this now to see what it'll look like. I have our previous instance of the code that we've written to initialize, set up, and send messages inside of CometChat. If you want to check that out, have a look at the previous video. But after a user has logged in, what I want to do is listen to messages. So I'm going to place in some commands over here. We'll actually place them before we start sending messages so that we can capture and listen to those messages as they come across. I'll start by quickly adding in a note that this section here will be listening to messages as they arrive. In order to complete this section, we're going to need to create a new variable. This variable will be the listener ID. The listener ID is a unique ID, but it's one that we get to define ourselves. We'll define this a little bit later on. The next thing we can do is add the listener itself. To do this, I'm going to call CometChat.addMessageListener, and then I'm going to pass in the listener ID we just created. We then have to define a new class. This class will be the CometChat.messageListener, and this is where we can start to define what events we are listening to. The way this works is that as messages are coming in, we can capture them. We'll start off with a basic text message. Using onTextMessageReceive, we can pull out the text message as a value. Then I'm going to simply console log it out to make it nice and simple for now, but in other situations, you can use this inside of an interaction. So here I'm going to console log out text message has been received successfully and log out the message itself. We can test this out later in console inside of our Chrome test project. Now the other thing that we can do inside of the CometChat message listener is listen for other types of messages as well. We defined messages as media messages before, so let's actually do that next. Let's pass in onMediaMessageReceived, and here we'll pull out the media message itself as a value, and this value will once again console log out so that we can view it once it arrives. And finally, we'll want to define the custom messages as well. We'll pass in onCustomMessageReceived, and here we'll pull out the custom message and we'll also console log that out. With all that done, we can head back to the top and define a better listener ID. I'm going to create one called incomingMessages_Adrian, and this will be defined a lot better because it's a lot more clear as to its functionality. We're now almost ready to test this out. We can open up our Chrome instance previously, where we created a custom message that we can send through this button. The one thing that you'll notice though is that when we do send this message from Adrian to Adrian, we basically aren't getting any kind of received message here. This is because this isn't captured as part of the listener message service. In order for this to work properly, we need to send this from an outside source, such as from another user or another method. So a useful way to be able to do this is to use the REST API, as we haven't implemented full chat functionality with different users just yet. What I'm going to do is show you how to set up the REST API to use for any particular reason. This is useful later when you set up a backend server. Let's head to messages, and here we'll want to head to send a message. First, we'll need to define our URL with an app ID as well as a region. So in this case, my region here is US. Next, we have to define the API call. This is very similar to what we did in JavaScript, where we set up the receiver as well as the receiver type, the type of message, and the message itself. We then need to place in the JSON details. So this is like the JSON application information. And we also send in who the user is as well as the API key. Now, if you don't have an API key for your REST, you'll need to define one from the dashboard. I'm going to log into my app over here and head to APIs and auth keys and head over to the REST API key. I've already generated one, but if you don't have one, you can generate a brand new one. I'm going to copy this key and I'm going to place this as the very last thing that we need. I did call my user superuser when it should be superhero, so I've just updated that, and then I'm going to try this call. And when I perform this call, we see that the data did come through. Superhero has sent Adrian a message here, and let's see if this has come up on our received messages. I'll open up the console and I'll do a refresh, and here we can see that inside of the console we now have a text message has been successfully received. We have all the metadata here as to the message itself, as well as who it's intended for, as well as who it was sent by. And this, in essence, is how the message listening service works. Now that we have a message listener, sometimes we might need to remove it, because as you build an application, you're going to need to build many for different purposes. Let's create a new function inside of our HTML called remove message listener. And in here, we're going to pass in a couple of things. It's just going to be the listener ID, which is the unique ID we created earlier. And this is why the ID is often used in order to reference it later, for example, if you need to remove the message listener. I'll place the incoming underscore messages underscore Adrian as we had previously, and then I'll pass in CometChat.remove message listener and pass in the listener ID. We can call this function anywhere. Sometimes we can even do it automatically. But in this example, I'm just going to add a new button called remove message listener, and this button will activate this function, which will remove the message listener. The goal here is to make sure we're no longer receiving messages to the user here. So I'm going to also console log this out as successful so that we know once it's activated. Let's give this a try. I'll also copy paste this console log command into our add message listener so that we know when it is active. If we open up Chrome now and head over to the developer tools, we should be able to see that the message listener has been successfully added, and there that message is there. And now let's remove it. And now that we've removed it, we can see that's console logged out. And I can head to the REST API and try and send a message from Superhero1 user as a message to myself as Adrian. And we can see that hasn't appeared because the listener is no longer in effect. Let's now take a look at missed messages. We looked at real messages beforehand, but what happens when a user or recipient isn't currently running the application or online? This is where you need to be able to load those missed messages. They come in a variety of types, such as unread messages or message history, or even just missed messages in general. We're going to do this in a couple of ways, but ideally we're going to be using the message request class. This is provided through the message request builder class, and here we'll be doing a couple of functions such as getting the last derived message ID, as well as doing things like fetch next as well as previous. Let's see how this looks inside of VS Code. I'm going to jump into the HTML file, and here I'm going to create a brand new function. This function is going to be the missed messages function, and it's going to pull any messages we might have missed while we're offline. It's also a async function, and we'll find out exactly why that is in a little bit. I'm going to create a button which is going to call this function. This button will just be called a missed messages button, and it'll call the same function for missed messages. Now, to start off with, we need a UID. The UID is the user ID that we're pulling the messages from. We also need a limit. The limit is how many we want to collect as a maximum value. So in this case, I'm setting 30. Lastly, we'll need the latest ID. Now to get this, we're going to call an await function, and this will be await CometChat.getLastDeliveredMessage ID. This will give us the ID of the last message received from that user. Great, so now we can define a message request. To do this, we're going to create a variable called message request, which is going to call new.CometChat.messageRequestBuilder. The builder is where we define exactly how we want to pull these messages across. So I'll first set the user ID. This is already set with passing in the variable UID, as well as the set message ID, which is the latest ID we defined earlier as well. Finally, we'll set the limit, which is just 30, and we'll build this message request using the message request builder. We can now call it. So let's call message request.fetch next. Then we're going to pull the messages that get pulled out. There are multiple messages here as an array, and we're going to console log them out just to view them for the time being. So I'm going to console log out messages.listFetched, and I'll pass out the messages. Of course, if there are any errors, let's also log those out. So here I'll pull out errors and I'll console log out the message list has failed, and we're going to log out the error as well. Now, in order to test that all of this works, we're going to have to do a few things, because we need to make sure that first we are receiving messages, and then we're going to have to miss a few messages so that we can call this function. There's a trick to this, so what we're going to do is open up Google and head to the debugging. Let's first test to make sure that we are receiving messages by simply calling one from the REST API. We can see that that was delivered successfully. We're going to head over to the network tab and we're going to go in offline mode. This puts Google Chrome in offline state, but it also means that we can't send any messages. So I've pulled up the Edge browser here and I'm going to send a message using the same REST API. If we have a look at the console here, we see that we're not receiving any messages. And this is because we're currently in offline mode. If we go online and select to run the missed messages function, we can see that we've had 2 missed messages from those 2 clicks I did from the REST API. So it looks like this function is working successfully. When we go back online, we can continue to send messages and they're coming through, and the missed messages are coming up as empty now. If, for example, you're trying to get the missed messages from a group rather than just an individual user, simply add a G in front of all the UIDs to create a group ID and update the group ID over here. This will effectively work exactly the same. What's useful is we can use this entire template we've just defined to do a number of things now, such as get the message history. It is essentially the same besides one value which changes. Instead of getting next, we're getting the previous. This way, we're getting the message history of the last 30 messages in a conversation with a user ID. Let's test this out. We'll jump into VS Code, and all I'm going to do is paste in fetch previous here. And this has updated this function from missed messages to message history. Let's actually copy out and paste a brand new one and actually call it that. So I'm going to call this history messages, and I'll create a new button for that as well. I'll update the function called here as well as the text for the button. And here I'll update this to previous. Let's test this out inside of Chrome now. I'm going to refresh and we have a new button here called History Messages. I'm going to open up the console and select to click that, and we can now see the last 30 messages inside of our conversation, which are all the same, but we can see that it is working effectively, and you could use this to load up a message history inside of a UI. The tool for using the message request builder is very powerful. You can even perform searches using it. We'll have a look at defining a keyword and using it to pull out the messages, only including that one keyword. So let's find out how we can do this. What we're going to do over here is search for a specific keyword using a brand new function called search messages. And this I'll also create a new button for. So let's define this just over here and call this search messages. What I want to be able to do here is search for a message with the keyword of hello. So I'm going to define that over here with a search term. I'll call this variable search keyword. And here I'm going to make sure I do a hello as the search term. Then I'm going to add this as part of the request. So in order to do this, I'm going to have to use a new command called set search keyword. In here, I'm just going to pass in the search keyword and we're done. Let's now open up our example here. We'll click search messages, and here, unfortunately, I've only ever used the keyword hello once in my very first message a long time ago where I said hello world. There are a number of other useful features and functions using message history, such as getting the last number of unread message counts for specific users or groups or as a whole. So what we can do here is create a new function called getUnread. we're going to call CometChat.getUnreadMessageCountForUser. And here I'm just going to manually pass in superhero1 as the user, and we want to console log these out. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to pass in then and pull out the array that is part of the response of this message. And then I'll pass in console.log message count, and we'll actually print out this array. Let's also add some error handling in here, and this is a nice succinct function which we can now use. Now I also want to create a button for this, so let me add that above, and we'll just call this unreadCount. Now it's time to test whether it works or not. Let's open up the console and select to click it, and when we do, we can see that we got our count here. For superhero1, we have 52 unread messages. Additional message filters are an important part of CometChat because they allow you to control what users see in terms of the messaging itself. This includes how many messages a user might be able to view at one time, or what types of messages a user can see inside of a conversation or a group, as well as excluding certain types of messages from, say, blocked users, as well as updating messages or even hiding them from certain users and groups as well. Now, in order to do all of this, we're going to be using the message request class. It's something that we need to become more familiar with in order to fetch messages based on the parameters we provide to it. It works in terms of the builder design pattern. This design pattern means that we use the message request builder class in the message request class. Now, this might seem a little bit confusing, but in essence, we use the message builder to then create a message request, which we use to fetch the messages. Nice and simple. So let's have a look at how this would happen. Normally, the first step would be to create the object using the message request builder class. This is where we're setting all the parameters we wish to set in order to get the messages we want. Once we've completed this step, we're going to call the build method. And this build method, as part of the message request builder, will generate a brand new object. And this object itself is used for the message request. Then we'll be using the methods of fetchNext as well as fetchPrevious as part of this call to grab the specific messages with the parameters we've created. Now they work a little bit different, where the fetchNext will return messages after the specified parameters, and the fetchPrevious will do the opposite. We'll have a look at more of this in a minute, but in terms of this, there is a few limitations on what we can do. Since messages are used using pagination, we have a maximum of 100 messages that can ever be pulled at one time. But this will just mean that you need to call the fetchPrevious or fetchNext method once more as part of the message request object to get the next series of messages. Let's start having a look at how we can utilize this inside of VS Code. This is the previous project we had. You can download this in the description. We're going to grab the last 50 messages as our first test with message filtering. In order to do this, we're going to create a new variable here called letMessagesRequest equal new CometChat.MessagesRequestBuilder. Here we can create a few variables. We'll start with our first one, setLimit50, which will limit it to 50 messages. Now we can build it. This class is now ready to use, so let's give it a shot. Let's call it, and we'll call messagesRequest.fetchPrevious, fetching the previous 50 messages. Then we'll actually grab that request and pull out the messages value, and we'll console log it out. I've just passed in messages.fetched, and then I'm going to pass in the value messages, and we can give this a test inside of our Chrome browser. Here I've got an instance of this running, and we can see that when we refresh and check the console, we've got a no fetch messages, and this is because we don't have enough values here to reference what we're fetching. So let's update this to fetch specific messages for a specific user. I'm going to set the user ID here to be Adrian, one that we created earlier. We've sent quite a few messages here back and forth. And immediately we can see that we've got 13 messages sent across, and we can view those messages. They've all been pulled out. While that's not 50, we could search up to 50 of them, and this has come out successfully. This is just the beginning though. We can now update some of these parameters and how it works. Let's actually fetch the next 50 messages and see what happens. When we try to do this, you'll see that it doesn't actually work. This is because when you're fetching next, you have to pass in an additional parameter, such as an ID or such as a date, so that you're fetching the next messages after that specific parameter. We can test this out in a second, but before we go on, let's actually update a few of these values to see how they work. Firstly, let's create a value here for the user ID, and we'll apply this as a variable when we're setting the user ID. We can also do groups. So if you want to set a group ID, simply update the user ID to a group ID and pass in the value for that, and that will also work. The next thing that I'd like to do is test out fetching the next messages after a specific point in time. Now, a good practice is usually to use the message ID. So let's give this a shot. What we'll do is create a brand new value here. Let's do let message ID, and we'll start off with just number 1, since I know that there is definitely a number 1 message. We'll set the limit here to 30 as a value as well that we can update in the future, and we'll pass all these values in. For the message ID, it's a simple command here of set message ID, and we'll pass in the message ID value. Now we can have a look at how this comes out in our console log. We can see that fetch previous from previous IDs of 0 comes out to nothing, because obviously there are no messages before the ID of 1. But we can do fetch next, and now we can see the fetch next command has worked. We've pulled out 12 messages after the ID of number 1. This is why it's not 13, it's just 12. Now let's take a look at creating a time zone as part of the filtered messages. Time zones are calculated using the Unix timestamp in seconds. We can see an example of this when we let the timestamp equal, well, whatever this date here is. I'm not too sure, so let's actually find out what the date is right now. We can do this by calling date.now and getting the value in milliseconds. We can remove this millisecond value to a second value by dividing it by 1000. Let's place this in, and this is right now. Now this value we can pass into our message request builder, and what we're going to do is call the method setTimestamp. Now in here we'll pass in the value, and this will be using a reference of this timestamp to search up the messages. Let's comment out the message ID, and this time what we'll do is open up console log and have a look at what messages we get next. And here we can see that next we don't get any messages because I haven't sent any after this point in time. Let's try fetch previous. And when we do fetch previous, well, those 13 messages that I've previously sent now show up. This is how we use the timestamps to filter messages. Let's take a look at another value that allows us to filter different types of messages. This one here is to check whether messages are read or unread. Using setUnread with a boolean of true will allow us to only view messages which have been unread. We can also set this to false to showcase only messages which have been read. Both of these values can be useful if you only want to display new or old messages per se. Occasionally, users want to block other users from sending them messages. This is where the next parameter comes into play, where you can specifically ensure that you hide messages from blocked users using the hide messages from blocked users parameter. When set to true as a boolean, this will make sure that any messages from certain users which have been blocked will be hidden. Let's test this out with Superhero1, which has sent Adrian a few messages. We have 30 messages here, so he's spamming them a lot. And these 30 messages are currently quite annoying and always popping up constantly. We'll jump into the REST API. Under blocked users and under Adrian's user ID, we'll add Superhero1 as a blocked user. This has been successful, and we can see that this request, which would normally be done by the backend, has successfully blocked SuperUser1 on Adrian's account. Now Adrian specifically can avoid messages from him when we use the parameter to block those messages. When we refresh the page, we can see that they're no longer popping up, which is absolutely great. Now if we want them to show up once more, we'll need to unblock Superhero1 from Adrian's account. We can do this as well in the REST API. Normally, if you want to test this out yourself, just copy in the API key for the REST system, as well as all the other variables, such as the user ID here being Adrian, and the blocked to unblock user being Superhero 1, and select to try and call this. Great, this has been updated, and Superhero 1 is no longer blocked by Adrian. Now he can view all the messages and they're all coming through just fine. Let's take a look at some of the other parameters that we can use inside of the filtering options here. There is another one that is called set updated after. And this is using the timestamp so that you can only search for messages after they've been updated based on this timestamp. Updates can include things such as if a message has been marked for read or delivered or edited or even deleted. Since this can come back with quite a lot of messages, there is another parameter we can set as a boolean called updates only true. This will make sure that we're only getting messages that are updated from that point in time, rather than every message that has been sent and received from that specific point in time. There are lots of different types of categories of messages. So being able to set the category type of messages that you want to filter for is also important. You can set this as an array, and there's quite a lot of options here, such as text or image or video or audio. If you want to have a look at the full list of options, what you can do is pull up the website, which I'll link in the description below, which shows all the different types of categories of messages. And you can use these just as plain text inside of an array and select which ones you want to look up. We can also filter messages by tag or with tags, which are two separate different things. Let's have a look at both. Let's first of all create some tags, and we're gonna do that just over here. I'm just going to create an array here, and for the array we'll do tag 1 and tag 2. Now this array here that we'll use, we've actually used in the past before somewhere in here. So I'm just gonna write in tags search. Now as part of this, I'm going to pass in a command here called set tags. And here I'm gonna put our tags to search. This will search any messages with these specific two tags in here. But sometimes you don't want to be that specific. You just want to search if a message has any tag at all. And this is where we can pass in with tags as a boolean and set that to true. This can work in conjunction together, or it can work by itself, or it can work independently. But both of these work slightly different, so make sure that you apply which one you need to based on the situation. Let's have a look at a number of other options here in terms of message conversation, something we haven't quite looked at yet. First of all, when you do have message conversations, you might get nesting happening. And this is where it might be useful to be able to hide these sorts of conversations. To hide a conversation, we're simply going to do hide replies. When we pass this in as a boolean, we're not going to be able to see those threaded conversations. But in another situation, maybe you might want to look up a specific thread or a specific conversation. You can do this simply by passing in set parent message ID and pass in the message ID that you want to search up, such as the ID of number 1. If there are any children conversations inside of this message ID, they will be presented as part of the thread. Finally, you might sometimes want to show deleted messages. This is kind of rare, but it really depends on how you're building your application. So the final command we can look at here is hide deleted messages to true or to false. And this will allow you to showcase if messages have been deleted and if those messages are available for you to see as well to fetch them, and decide how you want to present that. Traditionally, in CometChat, you can have conversations, and retrieving conversations allows you to get the last lot of messages for both one-on-one conversations as well as group conversations for users that are logged in. This essentially helps you build your recent chat list. We'll be taking a look at different ways that we can retrieve conversations, such as setting limits, as well as conversation types, as well as creating groups and tags in general. Let's start off with having a look at how to retrieve a list of conversations. If you watch the previous video where we take a look at message and message filtering, the structure for conversations are very similar. To break it down, what ends up happening is that we have a conversation request class. This pulls all the conversations that we need. But in order to use this class, we need to structure a request. So we use the conversation request builder class. This builds the structure that we use inside of the conversation request class, which can then pull out any type of message that we need. Let's take a look at a working example of this. I'm going to open up VS Code with the project that we've been working on the last few videos, which you can also find in the description below. I'm going to retrieve a list of conversations, and to do this, I'm going to pass in two variables. The first variable will be limit, and I'll set this to 30, which we'll use shortly. The next variable will be the letConversationRequest. Now, this conversation request will equal new space CometChat.ConversationsRequestBuilder. And here we'll set the limit to be the variable of limit of 30, and we'll build this request. We can now use it. Let's give this a use by doing a fetch next on it. We'll do conversationsRequest.fetchNext. Then we'll pull out the conversations that come from that request. We'll pass this value into a function and we'll console log it out. So here I'll just console log out conversations and then pass in the variable of conversations. And now I want to test what this will actually look like by opening this up on a Chrome browser. I've got a live server running here where I can view this file. So let's do this now. Let's open it up and have a look at what we see inside of the console. Here we can see that conversations have popped up. I have three main ones here. I have a group conversation, a one with Superhero 1, as well as one with myself. Now, let's see if we can set the conversation type for conversations. We can do this by setting a new variable called conversation type. I'm going to set the type to be group as a string here, and we're going to add this to the conversation request builder. We'll use set conversation type here, and then we'll pass in the variable of conversation type, which we set to group earlier. That is pretty much it. And now we should only see group conversations. Let's open up Chrome here and test this out. And I only had one previously, and if we open this up, this was the test group, which is now showing up. Great. We can also do the same for users. So let's set the conversation type here to user and have a look, and we can see I've got my two conversations of Superhero 1 as well as Adrian as the two conversations. Before we go further, let's have a look at what's inside a conversation object. This is useful to know if you're going to display it out in a user interface. The first one is the conversation ID. This is useful because it is a combination of the content that you're talking about. So for example, here we've got the ID of the first user, the ID of the second user, and the type of request it is here. This would apply the same here where I'm talking to myself. So here it's between Adrian and Adrian with the type being user. This should make it easier when you're structuring requests. You also have the conversation type here as user and user. If I were to remove the conversation type here that we previously set, we would see that now we should have a combination of the two. And for the conversation type here for the group, we just have group. The other aspect for the conversation ID for groups is that you just have the group underscore and the group ID itself. This is much easier to use. As part of this, we get one primary last message here, which is the last message inside of that conversation. This is useful to display inside of a UI, especially if you want to show a preview of what's happening in that conversation. And here you also have this metric here for conversation with, which gives you some more stats about the actual conversation itself, such as how many members there are, how many are currently online, and whatnot. Okay, now let's see if we can do some filtering for conversations. We're going to start off with something simple. We're going to check for users or groups that currently have tags. This will pull out conversations specifically with those kinds of people or groups that are using tags inside of them. We created some tags earlier for users and groups called tag1, and we're going to try and filter for these. To do specific filtering for a certain user that has a certain tag, this is where we use the set user tags, passing in the variable of user tags. I can check this in the Chrome tools in the console, but right now I don't have any specific user tags, so this comes out as empty. Alternatively, we can do the same for groups, where we can search for a specific group that has a specific tag tag by using the set group tags, passing in the variable group tags. Again, we could check this in console, but I don't have any group tags on conversations, so this will come up as empty as well. Taking a step back, instead of searching for users with tags or groups with tags, we can search for conversations with tags. This is where we can pass in with tags equals true. This is specific for conversations, finding if a certain conversation has a tag. Of course, we can have a more specific version of this by using set tags, and this will look for conversations that have a specific tag such as tag 1. Since I haven't been that specific for my previous conversations, this comes up currently as empty. Let's see if we can fix this by creating a tag as part of our conversation. I'm going to update the variable here to tags, and I'm going to call CometChat tag conversation, and this will tag a specific conversation for a user. I'm going to tag a conversation here for superuser1, and I'm going to set this as a user tag for user conversations with the tags I've applied here with just tag 1. Then I'm going to create a function that will console log out the conversations which I've just tagged now, and I'll console log this out over here as tagged conversations, and we'll check the value here for the conversations as well. Now with this, we should be able to console log this out. Now I see that here I've actually misset the user ID here. Instead of superuser1, it should be superhero1. So make sure you're very specific with the users you're tagging. Now I test this with tagging my own conversation for Adrian, user Adrian, and here that does work, and then I update this to superhero1, which was the conversation we previously had as well. With those two conversations now tagged, we can actually have a look at the tags in the console, which are just over here. We can now retrieve these tags when we're retrieving conversations as well. So let's test this. I'm going to comment out our tag conversation script here, and I'm going to re-enable the previous one here where we're using the request builder. I'm going to update here this to set tags, and I'm going to search through the tags we just set, and this works successfully. We have our two conversations here with superhero1 as well as Adrian both working and showing up. Now, sometimes when we're doing real-time messaging and sending and receiving messages, we need to convert those message objects into conversation objects. This can be done with the CometChat helper, which has a special method called getConversation from message, where you can pass a message value in and get a conversation value out. Let's take a look at how we can create this. So what we'll do is call CometChat.CometChatHelper. And here we're going to get the conversation from message method, and we're going to pass in a message in a second there, but for now we'll just set this as a message variable. Then we're going to pull out the conversation that would happen from that conversation of the message. We'll console log this out simply as a conversation. Now, since this command here requires a message to be passed in, we can actually copy this and paste it into a code example below, where we're pulling out a message that we can now convert into a conversation. We can test this out in our Chrome debugging tools here, where we're having a message sent. This is the message that was sent, and here a conversation is created with the group and the test group that I've done when I sent that message. Perfect. Threaded messages are just like normal messages, with the difference being that they've been started from a specific message rather than by themselves. This means that there is a bit of a parent-child relationship, where a message can have a parent and a parent can have one or many children messages. Threaded messages can get more complex, where one parent might have multiple messages and one of those children messages might have its own parent-child relationship with more messages, and so on. This is the essence of how threading works. Inside of CometChat, we can create threaded messages for most message types. We can create them for text messages, media messages, and custom messages. In order to create a threaded message, we need to make sure that the variable for parent message ID is set. In order to set this, we need to use the method setParentMessageID. Let's have a look at how we can do this inside of VS Code. I'm going to continue on from our project from before, which you can view in previous videos or download from the description below. Here, we're going to start off by creating the parent message. This will be the message that will kick off the thread. It won't be threaded itself, but it will have the children messages below. So what we're going to do is pass in let parent message equal new space CometChat.textMessage. I'm going to pass in the UID of Adrian, which is the user ID. I'm going to pass in the message itself, which I'm just going to say parent message. And then I'm going to pass in the message type, which is CometChat.receiver_type.user. Now I can send this message. To send it, I'm going to pass in CometChat.sendMessage. Then I'm going to pass in the message itself, which currently is called parent message. Then I'm going to console log it out. The response from this request will be a message which I'm going to have a look at because I want to pull out the message ID from this message and use it in the next request where we create the thread. For now, I want to make sure this is working. So I'm going to open up the console and I can see here that the parent message has been created. And there's an ID here that we can use later on, which is 243. Now that we know this message is being created, let's create some children messages underneath, which will be as part of the thread for this user conversation. What I'm going to do is create a new variable here. I'm going to pass in let messages equal new CometChat text message. It's going to have the same syntax more or less as we had for the parent message. I'm going to pass in the UID as well as the message text itself, which is children message inside of new thread. And I'm going to pass in the message type, which will just be user. The difference here, however, is that we'll be using a method called setParentMessageID. So what I'll do here is call messageID.setParentMessageID. And I'm going to pass in the ID of the message we just got previously. Each time I send a message, it's going to have a new ID, so making sure that you set this correctly will make sure that it's always dynamic. Great, now we have the essentials set to make sure that this is a threaded message. All we have to do now is send it. I'm going to pass in CometChat.sendMessage with the child message being the value that we pass through, and we'll get a response back here with a new message, and I can console log this out. I'm going to console log this out as the child message and view it as well. The only thing that I would recommend is not to reuse the same variables when you're creating scripts like this. So here where I have message listed twice as a response for both the parent and the child, I'm going to relabel the child message to something more specific such as child message reply or child message sent. Now that I've done this, I'll update the syntax and we should be able to test this out inside of a Chrome debugging tool. So let's open up our example here, open up the console, and we can see both our parent as well as our child message. I've got the ID of 244 for the parent, and if we go to the child message, we can see that the parent message ID is also 244. This way we can double check them back to back to make sure that they are the same, and this shows that we've set this up successfully, and we'll be able to turn this now into a threaded conversation. Let's move on to receiving real-time messages inside of threads. They work essentially the same. We previously looked at real-time messages in a previous video, and you can look that up. And we have the code ready to do that. We use the message listener class along with the add message listener method in order to be able to pull out messages that are sent and then display them however we want in the UI. Let's see what this looks like inside of VS Code, where we previously had this commented out. We'll uncomment this, and if you want to see how to set this up, it was in the previous video. But we'll reuse the listener ID here, as well as the add listener that we used as a method. And here we're getting a text message, medium message, and custom message as a response when we're listening for active real-time messages. What we're going to add is an if script. This if script will actually check the value that we get as a response. So in this case, it's a text message. We're going to check and get the parent message ID, and we're going to double equal sign and check if it's the same as the active thread ID. Now this thread ID is a value that you can set yourself. If it equals the same as the parent message ID, I'm going to console log out that this text message is part of an active thread. And this is essentially how it works. Of course, the active thread ID is the message ID of the parent, and the parent message is the one we said earlier when we had the value for parent message. So essentially we check the text message, make sure we get the parent message ID, and check if it's the same as the parent message ID that we had. we can copy this across to the other types of messages to perform the same sort of checking on the real-time messages. So if we have a media message or a custom message that has the same parent message ID as the parent message of the message received in real time, we can console log that out. Now let's move on to having a look at how to fetch all the messages for any particular thread. In order to do this, we'll be using the message request class as well as the message request builder. This is something we looked at previously when fetching conversations in previous videos, but the core essence will be to create and build a message request and then to pull out the messages that we're looking for. And we'll be using the set parent message ID in order to do this. Let's have a look at what this looks like inside of VS Code. What I'll do here is fetch all the messages for a specific thread. There are a few things that we'll need to define here, such as the limit, which I'll currently just set to 0. We'll also need the parent message ID, and we saw previously this was 244 for the message and the parent and child that we created. Finally, I'll need to create the messages request. Here, I'm going to pass in new space CometChat.messages request builder. We're going to set the limit here to the limit defined, and we're also going to set the parent message ID to the parent message ID we defined of 244. Now we can build this request and call it. I'm going to call it by calling messages request.fetchPrevious, and then I'm going to get a response. That response will be the messages for that thread. So let's take a look at that. We'll console log them out by calling console.log, calling this as messages for the thread and passing the messages that we receive in here. And we can test out that this works. Let's open up the Chrome tools here and let's see what we get. Here are the messages for the thread. We have one which we only defined, and this one has the parent message ID of 244. Beautiful. I can do the opposite and not show any types of threads. The way that this can be done is by passing in hide replies with a boolean of true. This hides any types of threads that would be gained as part of messages when performing the message request builder. Let's set a UID here and remove set parent message ID and see what types of messages we get back. I'll update the console log here to show that we're not getting any threaded messages, so I'll pass in don't get threaded messages, and let's open up the console now. Here are all the messages coming through, and we can actually open them up to have a look at their ID. If we have a look at the last one, it's got an ID of 250. And if we browse through, we'll eventually find that one where we originally created a parent, and that parent was 244. The child was 245, but we're missing that one. We move straight on to 246, which means that it has hidden that specific message which was part of a thread. I'll provide links in the description below to this documentation as well as the project files that we'll be using for this example today. Now, for editing messages, there's two main aspects. There is editing the message itself, which is a pretty straightforward task, as well as listening to events that happen when an edited message comes through. This is especially important when you're doing a real-time application because the listening events basically allow you to update in real time any messages that have been changed. Now, let's have a look at how we actually edit a message inside of CometChat. It's quite simple. There is a special method called edit message. This method basically takes in an object called the base message. This object is also a class that currently allows you to edit text messages and custom messages, though this might change in the future. Now, in order to edit messages, we need a message to edit. This seems pretty simple. We can create a brand new message, or we can pull up an existing message from an ID. Now in this example, I'm going to create a brand new Hello World message, and we'll use this as a template that we'll start to edit. For this, I'll need a receiver ID, which will be Adrian. I'll need the message text, which I'll put in as Hello World. I'll set the receiver type here using the CometChat.receiverType.user, and finally we'll create the text message, and this will be using the new space CometChat text message, passing in the receiver ID as well as the text message as well as the receiver type. With that done, we can now send this text message. To send it, we're going to pass in CometChat.sendMessage. We'll pass in the class that we've created here for the text message, and then we'll execute this. we'll receive back a message as a response, and this response will not just have the message, but it will also have something called the message ID, which we're going to be using as the main aspect to be able to identify and edit messages. So right now our text message class doesn't have an ID set. Whenever you're doing an edit message, you need to pass in the class of the text message. So you can either create a brand new one or use the existing one, which I'm doing here, but we need to set the ID. Since we received a response of the message ID, I'm going to plug that straight into here. After that, we need to make a change. For this, I'm thinking we'll just do a simple change where we set maybe the text to be something different. I'm going to set the text here to say new hello world. And this will just be a small edit to our existing message. Now we can run the command edit message by running CometChat.edit message, passing in the new object that we've edited it, and we'll then get a response back from CometChat. This response will have the new updates to this message, and we can actually console log this out and view it later on in debugging to see exactly how this has changed. And this is basically editing messages. So let's open up the console now and have a look at this. Opening up the console, we can see that our new message has been sent. Here is the original message from Adrian that has the text hello world, and you can see that this is working fine. If we open up the edit message, we can see it has the same ID that we previously had, but the text here has updated to new hello world. This is perfect and what we expect. If we look a little bit deeper, we get to see a few other things, including these edited at and edited by values. The edited at value basically tells the timestamp of when it changed, and the edited by basically tells you which user changed this message. You're not limited to just editing text messages. You can also edit other things, such as tags. So you could pass in updated tags to the message, such as tag 1 and tag 2. To be able to update this, we simply call the text message and the method setTags. We pass in the updated tags in here, and we just run the edit message just like we did before. Now if we open up the debugging tools, we'll find that if we check the edited messages, we'll find that it now contains the new tags that we've defined. Now be aware that this will not add or remove tags, it will replace tags. So make sure that if you have existing tags for the message ID, you collect them and add them as part of the new updated tags. If you want to have a look at different types of things you can actually edit for your messages, you can console log these out with the word set. Here you'll get a list of different types of data elements that you can update, including things like the metadata, as well as the category and much more. By default, CometChat allows certain roles to edit a message. These roles include the message sender, where they can modify their own message in a one-on-one conversation as well as in a group conversation. But on top of that, if you have group conversations, the group owner as well as the group modifier can also edit or modify messages within that group. Now it's time to take a look at real-time message edit events, because this is quite important if, for example, you're building an application and you need to see if a recipient or someone has edited their message while the application is running so that you can handle those inside of the UI. The way this works is basically like a listener, and this listener uses the message listener class and uses the method onMessageEdited, which gives you a response back of the message itself. Then you can handle this message however you need inside of your application. Let's see what this looks like creating it inside of our application so far. Here inside VS Code, I'm going to create a new section called the Create Real-Time Message Edits with the Event Listener. We'll create a new variable here called Listener ID. This can be anything you want, so I'm going to create the Adrian_listener as the ID here. Then we're going to call CometChat.addMessageListener. In here, we want to pass two main things. The first is the listener ID, which we've just created, and the second is a new class. This class is the CometChat.messageListener class. And in here, we're going to pass in the response back that we want to have when we basically get a message that has been edited. So we'll call onMessageEdited, we'll pull out the message as a variable, and then we'll just console log it out. Of course, if you have your own UI, you could update the state of that UI. I'll call this console log message listened for edit and print out the message variable. Now let's test this out. I'm going to do this by opening up the REST API and causing a edit to an existing message that we have. I've got the ID of an existing message and I've populated this form out and I've added a new tag to it. This tag just says help. Let's try this out. This has worked, triggering the message listener, and we can see the ID of 309 as well as the updated tag of help. Finally, let's take a look at missed message edit events. Basically, what happens if an application is in offline and you don't know that there was edits to a message while the application was not running? In that case, we're going to need to retrieve a list of the previous messages and have a look through them. They're going to come with additional values for edited at as well as edited by, which we can identify if they've changed. On top of that, if we, for example, pull in a list of 100 conversations, we can see the message ID that was edited. It'll also come with action objects that come with values of action, action on, and action by that help better identify this. Let's have a look at this in practice. If we open up VS Code, we can pull up the last 50 messages that we've just been conveying through. We're going to set the limit here to 50, and what I want to do is identify ones that have been fetched and have changed. Let's open this up in the Chrome debugging tools, and we're going to get a list of them over here. Now this list of 50, we've actually been modifying quite a lot of them near the bottom here. So I'm going to pull out this last one here and we can see this one hasn't been modified, but this one before that has. We can see the value here, action edited, with action by, allowing us to see the person who changed this, being myself, and the action for as well as the action on here. You can utilize these however you need in terms of your own UI, but this gives you a better idea of how it all works. Using this, we're going to have a look at how to delete a message, which is pretty straightforward. There's two main parts. The first is simply deleting the message, but then there is the idea of creating a listener which identifies when messages have been deleted so that they can be updated in real time. Let's start off with something simple. I've opened up VS Code with the project we've been working on in the last few videos. For this project, we're going to create a brand new message and then we're going to delete it. Now let's create our first message. Firstly, I'm going to create a new receiver ID, and this variable will just be Adrian. Next, I'll need to create a message text. For this text, I'm just going to simply pass in hello world, or maybe hello world message. Next, I'll need to add in a receiver type. Now, all of these things that I'm doing here are things that you can follow along in our earlier video where I sent a message, but I create a receiver type here of user. Now we're ready to create the text message as a new CometChat.text message where we pass in the receiver ID, message text, and the receiver type. With this done, we can now send the message. To do this, I'm going to call CometChat.sendMessage and pass in the text message class. Then I'm going to console log out the message itself. Now this is particularly useful now that we're going to be deleting a message because we can pull out the message ID. If you're building a message ID, you can actually pull this out in a number of ways, including using a backend server to pull out specific messages. But for this case, we'll do something simple. Now that we have this message with its ID, we can begin to delete it. To delete a message, it's quite simple. We just need to find out what the message ID is. Now you can normally pull this alongside a backend server, but in this case, we're just going to pull it out of the message ID from the message we just created. Now that we have this, it's simple as calling CometChat.delete message and passing in the message ID. Once we do this, we can call this to execute. And as soon as we do, we get a confirmation, such as message has been deleted successfully. Let's test this out. I'm going to open up a live server here, and we're going to have a look at the debugging to make sure this ran successfully. Let's receive this, and we can see that the message was sent successfully with the ID over here. Then we get a confirmation that the message was deleted with the exact same ID. A couple of other things to note is that when we delete a message, we get a couple of other values and properties which we can use. This includes the deleted at, which allows us to have a timestamp of when a message was deleted, as well as deleted by, which actually means that different people can delete a message. In this case, Adrian deleted the message. If we take a closer look at the types of users that can delete a message, you can have the message sender delete a conversation that they've sent one-on-one, where the message sender can also delete their own message from a group chat. But if there's an admin or a moderator in a group, they also have access to delete messages. This gives you some idea of what kinds of rules and user groups there are around deleting messages. But now, let's take a look at what happens if an application is currently running in real time and a deleted message occurs. If we want that deleted message to disappear from the application in real time, we'll need to use a real-time message delete event. An event like this can be used with a message listener class, where the listener is actually detecting whether an on-message deleted event has occurred and then identifying it and utilizing it to the way that you want to apply changes to the UI. Let's have a look at how to implement this in our own application. What I'm going to do is build one of these before we delete a message so that we can recognize that it's been activated. Most cases, you want to place this above the current commands that you're doing. And here, the very first thing I'm going to do is create a listener ID. It's something unique, and usually you want to identify it with the task that you're doing. In this case, I'm going to label it listen_for_deleted_messages. Next, I'm going to create the listener. I'm going to call CometChat.addMessageListener. In here, I'm going to pass in the listener ID, and then I'm going to pass in new space CometChat.messageListener. And in here, I'm going to pull out a specific thing, which will be the on message deleted event with the message being passed out of here. I'm going to console log this out as deleted message listener has been activated, or maybe just deleted message listener, and pass out the message that was deleted. Now we can test this out. In order to test it out though, I'm going to comment out our previous delete event, and I'm going to run this manually using the REST API. So to do this, let's open up the debugging tools, and in here I want to have a look that a message has been sent, and I'm going to pull the ID of 360 across to the REST API here and run this as a deleted message event. This should work when I hit try now, and I can see that this ran successfully with a response here on the right hand side of the browser, but on the left hand side in the debugging, it's also activated the delete message listener with the same ID for the message. This is perfect. We could update the state in the UI here, or we can even pull out some of these variables that we have, even the deleted at timestamp and the deleted by, which is by the app system since I use the core administrative REST API key. Now this is great. It seems to be all working in real time, but what happens if a user deletes a message when the application was offline or closed? How do we know those have been deleted? This is actually something we kind of touched on in the last video where we edited messages. You can grab the latest, say 50 or 100 messages and look through them in the console, for example, and see if they've been modified or deleted. Let's do this right now. Here I've got the last 50 messages. If we go to some of the last ones, we can see that there is an item here called action, and this action shows us that a message has been deleted. There are also the values here of action by, action for, and action on, all of which give you more relevant information about what's happening. But realistically, when we expand these out, it gives us all the details of who might be deleting a message and how they're deleting it, at what time they're deleting it, and what that message is. All of this can be used to update the UI, so it's a good idea to understand how this works in case you need to implement it into your application. Now that we know how to delete a message, let's have a look at how to delete a conversation inside of CometChat. It's very similar to deleting messages, except we use the delete conversation method. This takes in two parameters, including the unique ID of the conversation, as well as the type of conversation that is, whether it's user or group. This is actually done quite simply, so let's jump into VS Code and try it right now. First, I need to grab the unique ID of a conversation. This could be hard to do, but we have quite a few that I've made in the past. What I'm going to do is open up my console log of my last 50 messages, and here I have a conversation ID of Adrian_user_Adrian, a conversation with myself. I'm going to use this as the unique conversation ID, which I now want to delete. This is a regular user conversation. So here in type, I'm going to set this up as just user. Now we can call CometChat delete conversation. I'm going to pass in the UID as well as the type. And then I'm going to retrieve the result of that, which is the deleted conversation or just the conversation itself. I'm going to console log out that conversation. Let me open up the debugging tools here and click refresh. And unfortunately now it seems that I have no messages left to fetch because I seem to have deleted them all. And the Adrian_user_Adrian conversations no longer exist because I seem to have also deleted them all. But now that we know this works, we can apply it for groups just the same, passing in the group ID in here, as well as the syntax type here for group if we wanted to apply that change. Now for typing indicators, these are something that you'll use if you want to let a sender and receiver know who's typing. In order to do this, we'll be using the start typing method. This will inform a recipient that the logged in user has started typing. This can also be used as part of a group conversation, which we'll get into later. The way it works is that we use the typing indicator class, and this class here will pass in a user ID of the user you're talking to, and it will include the receiver type. We can do group types here where we would pass in the group ID instead. After that, we have a stop typing indicator, and both of these work by combining with a listener. Now this listener is mainly for real-time information where you want to trigger an event to show that the typing indicator has initialized. We use a messaging class with the onTypingHasStarted as well as onTypingHasEntered methods to be able to register different UI interactions. Alright, enough theory. Let's jump into VS Code and try this out. I've got the latest version of our VS Code here with this project that we've been working on the last few videos. You can download this in the description below. Here, we're going to utilize our very first typing indicator method. This method is to let people know that we've started typing. In order to do this, we first have to define who we're letting know. In this case, we need a receiver ID. Now, I'm just going to do the receiver ID as Adrian since I want to let myself know that I'm typing. In other cases, you could put in a different user or a different group. Once we've defined this, we need to set the receiver type. This is simply by setting the value for receiver type here as CometChat.receiver_type.user or group if we're working with a group. Next, we need to define the variable for the notification. So what we're going to do is define typing notification equals new space CometChat.typing indicator. Here we'll pass in the receiver ID as well as the receiver type, and this will basically initialize this class for use to show once we begin typing. Now, in order to kick this off, we need to call CometChat.startTyping. We'll pass in this class that we've created, and this will kick off any type of notifications that we want through our listeners, which we'll be setting up very soon. Now, in this case, we've set this all up raw, manually kicking off a typing indicator. But to do this properly, you would want to do it as part of a text input, where you've defined whether someone has hovered and focused in on that input and whether they have actually started to type. Then you can kick off this process or have full control over it depending on how you want to set it up. If the user has finished typing, we'll also need to call a method to let the typing indicator know that they've finished their typing session. To do this, we'll pass in CometChat.endTyping with the typing notification that we were using previously. This is where the typing notification can be important if you have different types of messages going to different types of groups as well as users. Beautiful. We can now set up the real-time typing notification listener. This listener will basically kick off an action every single time that the typing notification has been triggered, and we can update the UI however we want. The first thing we're going to do is define a listener ID. For the listener ID, I'm going to pass in typing underscore indicator underscore listener. Here, I'm going to define CometChat.addMessageListener. I'll pass in the message listener ID, and then I'm going to pass in a new space CometChat.messageListener. We're going to have two methods here we're going to be listening for. The very first will be on typing started. Here we want to pull out the typing indicator as a variable, which we're going to be using to essentially grab more information. We're going to console log this out for the time being, but in your own app, you can actually use this to change the state of your UI, as well as the typing notification that you want to display. The next thing that we want to define is the method for when the typing stops. So here we'll define on typing ended. We're going to pass in the typing indicator one more time, and we're going to also console log this out. Again, this is where within your UI you would make your changes, basically showing that the user on the other side of the console has stopped typing. But since this is a simple example, we're just going to console log this out and view the typing indicator and what kind of information we get across. Let's do a quick summary. We kick off a typing notification with CometChat.startTyping. This gets captured by the listener, which listens to typing started and changes the console or the UI state. And you can use lots of different listener IDs to create any type of UI changes you want. Let me open up the Chrome debugging tools so we can have a look at the typing started and ended. When we open up the object, we get quite a few different variables here that we can look at. We have the receiver ID as well as the receiver type, which is Adrian and user. We also have metadata. This is something that we can define before we kick off a typing notification. We also get the same sort of information for the typing ended details. This can be all used to update the UI based on how you want to set up your application. Transient messages are a special type of message. They're only available in real time and they're not actually saved or tracked anywhere. It's good if you want to keep things anonymous or only one time for things that are only online when people are online as well. To send a transient message, we're going to be using the send transient message method. In order to receive it, we need to listen to the on transient message received method, which is part of the message listener. Inside of CometChat, transient messages can be sent to users as well as groups, and we'll get into more in terms of how this is done inside of VS Code. But for now, we want to have a few things assigned, such as the receiver ID, receiver type, and the data we want to convey. This is passed into the CometChat transient message, and then we send that transient message once that class has been created. In order to view it, however, in real time, we need a listener, the message listener, where we're listening to the onTransient message received method and registering an event depending on how we want to interact with it. With all that theory done, let's jump into VS Code and try this out. Here's the project we've been working on in the last couple of videos. After a login has been completed, we're going to add in a code here to send a transient message. The first thing we're going to do is create the receiver ID. This will just be Adrian so that I can send this to myself. The next thing we need to do is set up the receiver type. Now for the receiver type, it's just going to be to another user. So I'm going to set this as CometChat.receiver_type.user. Make sure that this is all in capitals. The next thing we need to do is send some data. Now for the data here, I'm going to create my own data called live_reaction. Here I'm going to pass in heart. Basically, I want to pass in a heart emoji into my app as part of this transient message. This is something I can update in the UI as part of the message listener later on. But now let's define the transient message. Here I'm going to create a new class by calling transient message equals new space CometChat.transient message, passing in the receiver ID as well as the receiver type and the data to create that transient message. All we really have to do now is send it. In order to send a transient message that we've defined, we pass in CometChat.sendTransientMessage and pass in the transient message itself. That's it. Our transient message has now been sent, but in order for us to capture this inside of an application, we need a listener. Transient messages are only viewed in real time, so this real-time listener will only show it once it's been delivered. Let's have a look at how we set this up. Now, in terms of any type of message listener, we need to create a listener ID. So let's define a listener ID here by what it's doing. In this case, it's listening to transient messages. So I'm going to define this as transient_message_listener. Now I'm going to add a message listener by calling CometChat.addMessageListener. In here, I'm going to pass in two things. The first will be the listener ID that we've just created, and the next thing will be the new space CometChat.messageListener class. Now, as part of this message listener class, we're going to be only listening for one specific thing, and that is the on-transient message received. Basically, when a transient message is received by this message listener, it's going to perform a specific action. Now, this action is going to pull out the variable here for the transient message, and we're going to console log this out. In your own application, you can create some UI state based on the message itself, but for this example, we're just going to console it out to make it nice and simple. We're going to view this transient message, and ideally we should just be able to see the data that's involved in there as well, which will be the live reaction that we've created. With all of that done, we've set up all the essentials for transient messages to work. We can now test these out. I always like to put real-time listeners at the very top of my applications so that once we send a message, they should trigger. Let's test all of this out. Essentially, after we send it, we should trigger the on-transient message, and this should show us basically what's inside a transient message. Let's test this out, but first let's fix this to be uppercase. The next thing we need to do is open up Chrome. I've got a live server running here so I can test this out. In here, I'm going to open up the debugging tool and refresh this page. We're going to see that the transient message comes across here and it's console logged out. If we open up this transient message, we can see that its receiver ID is Adrian. It's got the live reaction here with the heart, which means that it all has come together. Transient messages work the same for users as they do for groups. The only thing you need to do is change the receiver ID to the group you're assigning to and the receiver type to group. That's basically it. Finally, it's worth noting that when you do get transient messages coming across, you get a number of parameters that you can utilize for the app UI. You get the sender of who originally sent the message as well as the receiver ID it's intended for. You get the receiver type as well as the data itself. If we take a look at our example from earlier, we can see that while we get the data as well as the receiver ID, we also get the sender in here. In this example, I used Superhero1 to send the transient message. It also gives you all the details about Superhero1, which basically can be used, including the avatar as well as when they were last active, so that this can also update the UI state in your application. Delivery and read receipts are something that we use in real-time applications to allow people to know once a message has been successfully sent as well as read. In order to do this in CometChat, we're going to be using the method markAsDelivered to ensure that a message has been properly delivered. This will take in the parameters of message ID, receiver type, and sender ID. All of this works the same for user conversations as well as group conversations, and by default you'll want to mark all messages as delivered whenever a user opens up the window for a conversation. Let's have a look at the code involved to do this. Here I've got the latest version of VS Code up and running from our previous project. After a user has logged in, we'll define how to mark a message as delivered. First, we'll define a variable called message ID. This will be the message ID that we want to set as delivered. Next, we need to define the receiver ID. This is the ID of the person or group who will be receiving the message in order to mark it as having been delivered. Next, we'll need the receiver type. This can be either user or group. And finally, we need to define the sender ID. And this is the ID of the user who sent the message. With all that done, we can now run the method to confirm that the message has been delivered. To do this, we'll pass in CometChat.markAsDelivered. Here, we'll pass in all the variables we just defined, which includes the message ID, the receiver ID, the receiver type, as well as the sender ID. Now, something to take note here is that we don't need a then or anything after that. This can be executed nice and simply like this. Now let's test out how this would work in the real world. Here I've got the REST API and I'll head over to list messages. I'll perform this API request and pull up the latest message ID here that I have, which is 229. This is actually a group message, and this one here was sent a while back. Let's update the parameters here with the ID as well as the sender, which is myself, Adrian. We'll update here the receiver ID as being the test group, which means we update the receiver type here to be group. Now, let's also take a look at how to mark a message as read, because we can use pretty much all the same syntax and it's only a minor change. To mark a message as read, we're going to call CometChat.markAsRead. Here, we'll pass in pretty much the exact same variables in the same order in order to mark this conversation as read. This will include the message ID, receiver ID, the receiver type, and the sender ID. There is another quicker way we can do this. In a previous video, we sent a message using CometChat from Adrian to Adrian. The response back is a message itself with additional parameters we can now use to mark a message as read. Let's try this. Here I'm going to pass in CometChat.markAsRead. Instead of setting the variables, we'll pull them out of the message. In this case, we'll pull out message.getID. We'll also pull out the message.getSender. We'll get the ID of that sender by pulling out getUID. We'll pass in the type of user here as user in plain text. And finally, we'll pull out the message.getSender.getUID. And this is now ready to be used. Let's do a try catch here where we're going to try to pull out whether this was successful or not and console log it out. And if it failed, then we can console out that it failed along with the error that might have caused it not to work. We can open up the Chrome console and give this a shot. And when we do, we can see that the message that was sent has now also been marked as read, and that was successful, which is great. And another even quicker way to do this is literally to just pass in the message itself. It should be ready and it should be marked as read when we refresh it in the console, which it is. Awesome. The same practice can be applied if you want to mark a message as delivered. Let's copy paste this syntax and mark this as delivered instead of as read. We'll find that it works exactly the same. If we wanted to test this out, we don't have a console log right now. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and add that in by simply copy pasting the syntax that we previously had just up to the line then. And we'll replace the wording here from marked as read to marked as delivered. Now, if we open up the console, we'll see that both of these messages have been both set as delivered as well as read. Now, let's take a step back and have a look at how we detect when there are delivery alerts as well as when conversations or messages have been marked as delivered or marked as read. We can do this with a real-time listener. As in previous examples of videos, we're going to first start off creating a listener ID. This is a unique ID that you can label to be whatever you want, but normally you want to label this with what you're currently trying to get the listener to do. In this case, we're going to label this as a receipts_listener, which will be nice and simple. Next, we want to create the listener itself. We can do this by calling CometChat.addMessageListener. With this message listener, we need to pass in the listener ID. We can pass this in next here with listener ID. And next we create a new space CometChat.messageListener. In here, we only want to pull out two main methods. The very first one will be the onMessagesDelivered. We'll pull out the variable here of the message receipt. I'll be able to pass this variable to a console.log. So what will be happening here is that we'll be listening for any time there is a message delivered and we can perform an action. That action could also be something like, for example, updating the UI of your internal application. But in this case, we are going to keep it nice and simple. Now, the other aspect here is to also identify when a message has been seen. In that case, we can pull out the method onMessageRead, and we can follow more or less the same syntax, where we pull out the variable here for the message receipt, and we can console log this out, or for example, update the UI state of the application. Here I'm just console logging it out, so we'll pass in message read and pull out that variable here in the console for message receipt so that we can view it. And that's pretty much it for our message listener, which is now ready to be used. There are cases where you don't want to listen to all message delivery or read alerts. You just want to pull out a very specific one. This is where looking up the history for a single message can be useful. In order to look up a receipt history, what we need is to pull out the message ID. The message ID of the message is the unique ID that is created whenever a new message is sent. I've got an example here of 430, which I'm going to use, but normally you'd want to pull this out depending on what you're utilizing. Now, since I've already used this variable, I'm going to relabel this to message unique ID. And now we call one simple command, which is CometChat.getMessageReceipts. We'll pass in the message unique ID variable here, and then we can console log this out. When we run this method, we're just going to get one main attribute out, which is the receipts. And here you can use this to update the state of your UI, or for example, just simply console log it out. And that's pretty much it. This is also one of my favorite commands because of how simple it is, especially if you're trying to track receipt history, and if you want to know if a message has been properly delivered and read. Now, of course, I always recommend having some error handling here in case something goes wrong. So here I'm just going to pass in error, and if the message unique receipt has an error, it'll just console log that out. That pretty much covers all of message receipts. Of course, if you want more information, you can check out the official documentation.
I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This crash course has been put together over the last month or two with lots and lots of videos to really give you an inside view into messaging. But what we're going to do is continue to do videos here and there on things like calling and other aspects of real-time communication as part of CometChat. On top of that, we might do some additional crash courses in the future. So let me know if you enjoyed this one in the comments below. Otherwise, make sure you guys hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.